In the annals of American history, the brutal realities of slavery are often glossed over or sanitized. While the stories of physical labor, harsh conditions, and systemic racism are widely known, the sexual abuse and exploitation of male slaves remain largely unspoken. In this video, we delve into one of the most heinous aspects of slavery: the sexual abuse of male slaves, including the practice known as buck breaking. This brutal form of punishment and control was not only a tool of humiliation, but also a method to instill fear and submission among the enslaved population. Before we proceed, please take a few seconds and click the subscribe button to join this community. Buck breaking was a particularly vicious form of sexual abuse inflicted on male slaves. The practice primarily took place in the Caribbean, but was also known in parts of the American South. It involved the public rape of male slaves by their white masters, often in front of other enslaved people, including the victim's family. The aim was clear: to emasculate the male slave, destroy his sense of self-worth, and send a terrifying message to others who might consider defiance. The process typically began with the selection of a strong, defiant male slave, often referred to as a buck. This term itself was dehumanizing, reducing the man to nothing more than an animal, a beast of burden. The chosen buck was beaten mercilessly, often until he was bloody and barely conscious. This beating took place in front of the entire plantation community to serve as a public spectacle. One particularly notorious instance of buck breaking occurred in the early 1800s on a large plantation in Virginia. A slave named Samuel, known for his resistance and strength, became a target for his master's wrath. After an attempted escape, Samuel was captured and subjected to buck breaking. His master, in a display of dominance, forced other slaves to hold Samuel down over a tree stump where he was publicly raped. This horrific event not only shattered Samuel's spirit, but also served as a gruesome warning to others. The psychological impact of witnessing such an act was profound, instilling deep fear and submission among the enslaved community. In addition to sexual abuse, male slaves were often subjected to forced breeding. Breeding farms were established across the southern states, where male slaves were selected for their physical attributes and forced to impregnate female slaves. These breeding farms were part of a larger economic strategy to increase the slave population without the need to purchase new slaves from the transatlantic trade, which became increasingly restricted in the 19th century. One of the most infamous breeding farms was located in Richmond, Virginia. Owned by the notorious slave trader Robert Lumpkin, the Lumpkin's Jail Complex was not only a holding facility for slaves, but also a breeding farm where enslaved men were forced to father children. These children were then sold off to other plantations, continuing the cycle of exploitation. In these breeding farms, male slaves were expected to impregnate multiple women each year. Those who failed to meet the required quota were often punished, sometimes even castrated. This dehumanizing practice reduced these men to mere breeders, stripping them of their dignity and humanity. One particularly brutal example involved a slave named James, who was forced to father over 20 children before he reached the age of 30. James was frequently moved between different plantations to maximize his reproductive output, a common practice among breeding farms. While male slaves were often subjected to sexual violence by their masters, they were not immune to the advances of female slaveholders. In some cases, male slaves were forced into sexual relationships with white women, either as a form of coerced concubinage or as part of the broader system of sexual exploitation. One such case was that of Thomas, a young slave in South Carolina in the 1830s. Thomas was singled out by his owner's wife, who repeatedly forced him into sexual acts. The power dynamics in these situations were skewed heavily against the enslaved men, who had no legal recourse and were at constant risk of severe punishment or death if they refused. These relationships were often marked by violence and control, with the male slave having no autonomy or consent. The children born from these unions were typically born into slavery, further perpetuating the cycle of exploitation. The sexual abuse of male slaves had a profound psychological impact. both on the victims themselves and the broader enslaved community. For the victims, the trauma of such experiences was compounded by the public nature of the abuse. Being raped in front of one's family and peers was designed to strip away any remaining sense of self-worth and to break the individual's spirit completely. The humiliation and emasculation that came with sexual abuse often led to long-term psychological scars. Some victims became withdrawn, while others developed deep-seated anger and resentment that could manifest in acts of rebellion or violence. However, the fear of further abuse often kept these feelings suppressed, trapping the victims in a state of perpetual fear and subjugation. For the broader community, witnessing such acts of brutality served as a powerful tool of control. The fear of suffering the same fate kept many enslaved people in line as the threat of sexual violence loomed large over their daily lives. This fear was particularly potent for younger male slaves who were acutely aware that they could be targeted as they grew older and stronger. Beyond the individual acts of sexual violence, male slaves were sometimes forced into participating in orgies organized by their masters and their male friends. These gatherings were grotesque displays of power, where the enslaved were coerced into engaging in sexual acts with each other and with their owners. These orgies were often held as a form of entertainment for the slaveholders, who reveled in their ability to control every aspect of their slaves' lives, including their most intimate moments. In some cases, these events were used as a way to further humiliate and degrade the male slaves, stripping them of their masculinity and reducing them to mere objects of perverse pleasure. The psychological toll of these forced orgies was immense, adding another layer of trauma to the already brutal lives of the enslaved men. Despite the overwhelming odds, some enslaved men resisted their sexual exploitation. Acts of resistance took many forms, from outright defiance and escape attempts to more subtle forms of non-compliance. However, the risks associated with resistance were immense, and the consequences were often fatal. One story of resistance involves a slave named David Walker, who managed to escape from a plantation in Georgia after being subjected to buck-breaking. Walker fled to the north, where he became an outspoken abolitionist, writing extensively about the horrors of slavery, including the sexual abuse of male slaves. His writings, particularly Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, shed light on the darker aspects of slavery and called for immediate emancipation. Survival for those who endured such abuse often meant finding ways to cope with the trauma, whether through religion, forming close bonds with other enslaved people, or in some cases, internalizing the pain and focusing on the survival of their families. The sexual abuse of male slaves is a dark chapter in American history that is often overlooked. These acts of brutality were not only physical but also psychological, serving as tools of control and dehumanization. Understanding this aspect of slavery is crucial to fully comprehending the depth of the horrors endured by enslaved Africans in America. As we remember these atrocities, it is essential to honor the resilience and strength of those who endured such unimaginable suffering. Please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more of Global Insights.